The silence in the Montana wilderness was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the weight of your own existence. For Grant Thorne, that was exactly what he needed. At 43 years old, his tall frame still carried the coiled strength of his Navy SEAL years, though the weight sat differently now. Heavier, more deliberate. His gray-blue eyes, the color of storm clouds over the Pacific, scanned the snow-covered landscape with the practiced efficiency of a man trained to spot danger before it spotted him. Short-cropped hair showed silver at the temples, and a neat beard framed a face that had seen too much and said too little. He wore the same uniform he'd worn for the past 3 months. An olive field jacket worn soft at the elbows, unzipped over a red and navy flannel shirt. Cargo pants in forest green. Brown leather boots that had carried him through deserts and mountains and now through knee-deep Montana snow. On his wrist, a military-issue watch that had stopped keeping time that mattered years ago. Grant had bought this land sight unseen. 40 acres of nothing, 3 hours from the nearest real town, accessible only by a logging road that disappeared under snow from November to April. He'd spent his last savings on it. Every dollar from his discharge pay his disability checks, the small inheritance from a grandfather he'd never known. All of it gone into this one desperate purchase. A place to disappear. The cabin was older than the trees surrounding it, a structure of dark logs and stone that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. One room, one wood stove, one window facing north toward the endless expanse of wilderness. No electricity, no running water. No neighbors for 15 miles in any direction. Perfect. Grant stepped out of his truck, a battered Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, and surveyed his new kingdom. February in Montana. The landscape was a study in whites and grays, punctuated by the dark verticals of pine trees heavy with snow. The temperature sat at 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind carried the promise of more cold to come. He began unloading his gear, military surplus mostly, a sleeping bag rated to -40, dried food in vacuum-sealed bags, water purification tablets, a medical kit that could handle anything short of a sucking chest wound, and wrapped carefully in an old blanket, his rifle. A Remington 700 that had served him well in places he tried hard not to remember. The cabin's interior smelled of must and mouse droppings and the ghost of fires from decades past. Grant didn't mind. He'd slept in worse places, much worse. He set about making it habitable with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd built countless temporary homes in hostile territory. Sweep the floor, check the chimney, test the wood stove, inventory his supplies. As darkness fell, he got his first fire going. The wood was old-growth pine he'd found stacked in a lean-to behind the cabin, left by some previous owner who'd probably died before using it. It caught quickly, and soon the small space filled with warmth and the snap and crackle of burning resin. Grant sat in the cabin's only chair, a wooden thing with a curved back that creaked under his weight, and stared into the flames. This was what he'd come for. The fire, the silence, the absence of questions he couldn't answer, and orders he couldn't follow, and decisions that cost lives. His mind drifted as it always did when he stopped moving back to Iraq, 2008. The city of Mosul, where the streets smelled like sewage and cordite and fear. He'd been a team leader, then responsible for 6 other men. Good men, the kind who'd follow you into hell if you asked. He'd asked. The IED had been buried under a false floor in a building they were clearing. Martinez had been on point, young, fast, eager. 23 years old, with a wife back in San Diego and a baby daughter he'd never seen. Grant had given the order to breach. Martinez had gone through the door first. The explosion had been instantaneous. 1 second Martinez was there, the next he was scattered across a room that had become an abattoir. Grant had carried what remained out of that building, had written the letter to Martinez's widow, had attended the funeral and looked that baby girl in the eye, and known with absolute certainty that he'd killed her father. The official report called it unavoidable. The medal they gave him called it heroic. Grant called it what it was, his fault. He'd left the service 6 months later. Honorable discharge. They tried to talk him into staying into counseling, into all the things the military did when a good operator started to break. He'd refused, taken his papers, his final paycheck, and started driving. That had been 3 years ago. Since then, he'd drifted. Construction work in Nevada, security guard in Oregon. A brief stint as a hunting guide in Wyoming that ended when he'd walked off the job mid-hunt, unable to stomach the rich clients and their casual cruelty to the animals they killed for sport. Montana was supposed to be the end of the line, the place where he finally stopped running and just existed in whatever silence he could find. The fire burned low. Grant added another log and settled back in the chair. Tomorrow he'd need to scout the property, check the well, cut more firewood. But tonight, for the first time in years, he had no mission, no objective, no one counting on him to make the right call. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like drowning. The morning came gray and cold, the sun hidden behind a ceiling of clouds that promised snow. Grant woke stiff, his neck protesting the night spent in the wooden chair. He'd meant to set up his sleeping bag, but exhaustion had claimed him first. He stepped outside to relieve himself and assess the weather. The thermometer nailed to the cabin's exterior wall read 8 degrees. The wind had picked up overnight, carrying with it the smell of more snow coming in from the north. He'd need to make a supply run before the weather turned. The nearest town, Whitefish, was a 23-mile drive down the mountain on roads that were more suggestion than reality this time of year. Grant took the truck, four-wheel drive, engaged, and navigated the switchbacks with the caution of a man who knew exactly how far it was to fall. Whitefish was the kind of town that appeared on maps but barely existed in reality. Population somewhere around 7,000, swelling to double that during ski season when tourists came to visit the resort on the other side of the mountain. Main Street consisted of a gas station, a grocery store, a diner, a hardware store, and a bar that opened at 10 in the morning for the serious drinkers. Grant pulled into the diner's parking lot. He needed information about the property, about the well system, about which roads stayed passable in winter. The kind of information you didn't get from real estate listings. The diner was called The Antler, and it looked exactly like every other small-town Montana diner Grant had ever seen. Vinyl booths in faded red, a counter with swivel stools, laminated menus sticky with syrup, the smell of coffee and bacon grease and decades of small-town gossip. He took a stool at the counter. The place was maybe a third full. A couple of older men in Carhartt jackets and feed store caps, a young woman with a baby in a high chair, and in the corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee and a newspaper, an elderly woman with white hair and eyes that tracked him the moment he walked in. The waitress approached. She was in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a name tag that read May. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She poured, and Grant wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his cold fingers. "You're new," May said. It wasn't a question. "Bought the old Hartwell property up the mountain." May's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been surprise or might have been concern. "That place has been empty for years." "I know. No power, no phone lines, roads barely passable." "I know that too." May studied him with a frank assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people across a diner counter. Running from something or running to something. Grant met her eyes. "Does it matter?" "Suppose not." She pulled out her order pad. "What can I get you? Eggs, bacon, toast, whatever's easy." As May walked away, Grant became aware of the woman in the corner booth. She was watching him with an intensity that made his instincts prickle. She was perhaps 75 or 80, thin in the way of people who'd forgotten to eat, dressed in layers of worn sweaters despite the diner's warmth. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. Their eyes met. Hers were sharp, alert, the eyes of someone much younger trapped in a failing body. Then she stood moving with careful determination and walked to the counter. She sat on the stool next to him without asking permission. "You bought the Hartwell land," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "That's right. I'm Eleanor Hartwell." Grant turned to look at her properly. The realtor said the property had been an estate sale for 6 years, said the owner was deceased. "My husband was deceased. The land was still mine." She paused. "Until I sold it to you." Grant processed this. "You're the seller. I needed the money, and I needed someone to be there." "Why?" Eleanor's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "Because something's not right up there, and I think my husband died trying to prove it." Before Grant could respond, May returned with his food. She glanced between Grant and Eleanor, her expression darkening. "Mrs. Hartwell, you shouldn't be here alone. Your nephew said—" "I don't care what Travis said." Eleanor's voice carried surprising steel. "I can go where I please." May's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more, just refilled both their coffee cups and retreated. Grant ate in silence, aware of Eleanor's presence beside him. She didn't speak again, just stared at her coffee as if reading prophecy in the dark liquid. Finally, Grant broke the silence. "What happened to your husband?" "Officially, he was declared missing in action in 1974, Vietnam. They never found his body." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He wasn't in Vietnam." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "He was in Montana, looking for proof of something the Navy wanted buried." Grant felt the familiar warning signs. Conspiracy theories, grief-driven delusions, the kind of thing lonely old people convince themselves of to make sense of loss. Mrs. Hartwell, I know how it sounds, she interrupted. Crazy old woman who can't accept her husband's death. But Silas sent me a letter. One letter postmarked from Montana 3 months after they declared him dead. It said he'd found something, that he had proof, that he'd come for me when it was safe. And I never heard from him again. For 50 years I waited, searched, asked questions no one wanted to answer. Then 3 months ago, my nephew Travis said he'd help me buy back the land where Silas's last letter was postmarked. Said we could finally find out what happened. Grant saw where this was going. But he didn't help. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. He took my money and disappeared. The realtor called me last week to say the property had sold to someone else. To you, them. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A photocopy of an old letter, the original so faded the writing was barely visible. This is what Silas sent, the last thing I ever got from him. Grant unfolded it. The handwriting was cramped. Hurried, Eleanor. I found it. The railroad spur in Dead Valley. They dumped it here, 40 tons at least. I have documentation, photos, enough to bury them all. But they know I know. I can't come back yet. I'll send for you when it's safe. Keep this letter. If anything happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. The land deed is in your name now. I made sure of it. I love you. Always. Silas Grant read it twice. What did he find? I don't know. He never told me. And then he was just gone. And your nephew, Travis? I thought he was helping. I was so grateful. He said he'd use his environmental consulting connections to investigate. Said we'd find answers together. Her voice cracked. I gave him everything. My savings, the deed transfer, access to all of Silas's old papers. Then he stopped returning my calls. Grant folded the letter and handed it back. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but I bought that land to be left alone. I can't. He stopped. Through the diner's front window, a dog had appeared. A German shepherd, magnificent even from a distance, sitting perfectly still on the sidewalk. Its eyes were fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made Grant's tactical instincts flare. That's your dog? Eleanor turned. Her face transformed. All the hard years fell away, replaced by something like joy. Boone, she whispered. She stood so quickly her stool nearly toppled. Grant caught it. She moved toward the door with surprising speed, and Grant followed, compelled by something he couldn't name. Outside, the dog remained motionless. It was a beautiful animal, 7 or 8 years old, with the classic black and tan coloring of a working-line German shepherd. But something was wrong. Its stance was too rigid, its breathing too shallow. Eleanor dropped to her knees in the snow. Boone, oh my God, Boone. The dog's tail moved once, a single slow wag. Then it collapsed. Grant was moving before conscious thought. He knelt beside the animal, his hands automatically checking for injuries with the efficiency of years of combat medical training. Blood. Fresh blood, still liquid despite the cold matting the fur along the dog's right flank. He probed gently and found it. A knife wound. Deep. Deliberate. The kind of cut made by someone who knew exactly where to place a blade to cause maximum damage. We need to get him to a vet, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. No time. He's going into shock. Grant looked up at May, who'd followed them outside. I need towels, clean ones, and your first aid kit. May disappeared without question. Grant kept pressure on the wound. The dog's eyes found his. There was intelligence there, understanding, and something else. Determination. Easy boy, Grant murmured. Stay with me. May returned with towels and a white plastic box. Grant worked quickly, pressure bandage, wrapped tight. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. The dog needed stitches, needed antibiotics, needed professional care, but there was no time for that. My truck, Grant said to Eleanor. Can you walk? Yes. Then we go now. He lifted the dog carefully. 70, maybe 80 pounds of muscle and bone and fading life. The animal didn't struggle, didn't whimper. Just watched him with those intelligent eyes. They made it to the truck. Grant laid Boone across the back seat. Eleanor climbed in beside him, her hand stroking the dog's head. Where's the nearest vet? Grant asked. Kalispell, 40 miles. Grant calculated. Mountain roads, snow coming in, the dog's condition. He won't make it. Then where? My cabin. I've got medical supplies. I can stabilize him there. He didn't wait for permission. just started the engine and pointed the truck toward the mountain. They drove in silence, Grant pushing the F-150 as fast as he dared on roads that were more ice than asphalt. Behind him, he could hear Eleanor's voice, soft and constant, talking to the dog, telling him to hold on, telling him she was here, telling him he was a good boy. The words stirred something in Grant's chest, something he'd thought he'd successfully buried. The cabin appeared through the trees like a promise. Grant parked as close as he could get, then carried Boone inside. The fire had burned down to coals, and he quickly built it back up. Warmth was essential. Shock was the real killer. He laid the dog on the floor near the wood stove. Eleanor followed her movements, slow but determined. Grant retrieved his medical kit, military surplus designed for battlefield trauma, suture kit, antibiotics, antiseptic, pain medication, everything he needed except veterinary expertise. "I'm not a vet," he said to Eleanor, "but you can help him." Grant looked at the dog, at the wound that was still seeping blood despite the pressure bandage, at the animal's breathing which had gone shallow and rapid. He thought of Martinez, of trying to stop bleeding that couldn't be stopped, of the weight of failure. "I'll try." He washed his hands in the bucket of melted snow he kept by the door, put on the latex gloves from the kit, removed the temporary bandage, and assessed the damage properly for the first time. It was bad. The knife had gone deep, slicing through muscle and possibly nicking something internal. But miraculously, it had missed the major blood vessels. That's why Boone was still alive. Whoever had done this had been cruel but not quite competent enough to kill. Grant cleaned the wound with antiseptic. The dog's only reaction was a slight tensing of muscles. No sound, no struggle, just that same steady gaze. "Good boy," Grant heard himself say. "Stay still for me." He began to stitch. Field sutures, nothing fancy, just closing the wound layer by layer, working from the inside out. His hands remembered the movements. How many times had he done this on himself, on his teammates, on local civilians caught in crossfire? Too many times. He worked for 30 minutes, his world narrowing to the point of the needle, the pull of the thread, the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. When he finished, he applied antibiotic ointment and wrapped the wound in clean gauze. "That's all I can do," he said to Eleanor. "The rest is up to him." Eleanor was crying silently, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you." Grant stood, his knees protesting. "He needs water, small amounts, and quiet." He filled a bowl from his water supply and set it near the dog's head. Boone's eyes tracked the movement, but he didn't try to drink. Just watched. Waited. "You should stay," Grant said to Eleanor, "until we know he's stable. I don't want to impose. You're not. There's only one chair, but I can make you comfortable by the fire." He did, arranging his sleeping bag as a cushion, adding more wood to the stove, until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. Eleanor settled into the makeshift bed with a grateful sigh. "I haven't seen Boone in 3 months," she said quietly. "Not since Travis took him." Grant's attention sharpened. "Your nephew took your dog. Said he'd be better off at his place while I sorted out the land situation. Said I was too old to care for a big dog properly." Her voice hardened. "I believed him. I believed every lie he told me." "Where does Travis live?" "He has a condo in Kalispell, works for some environmental consulting firm, or so he says." Grant looked at the dog, at the knife wound, at an animal that had somehow made it through a Montana winter injured to find its owner in the one place she might be. "That's not a random attack," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's not." They sat in silence as daylight faded outside, the cabin filled with the sound of the fire, the dog's steady breathing, and the weight of questions neither of them could answer. Finally, as full darkness settled over the mountain, Grant spoke. "Tell me about Silas, everything." And Eleanor did. She'd met Silas Hartwell in 1971 at a USO dance in San Diego. She was 25, working as a secretary at a naval supply depot. He was 27, a Navy SEAL fresh from his second tour in Southeast Asia. They danced twice. By the third dance, she knew she was going to marry him. They were engaged within 3 months, married 6 months after that in a small ceremony with a handful of friends and family. Silas had one more deployment ahead of him, then he was going to leave the service. They'd buy land somewhere quiet, Montana maybe, build a house, start a family. That was the plan. But in late 1973, Silas's demeanor changed. He'd received orders for a new assignment, not combat, something else. He couldn't tell her what. Classified, he said. Just a few months. Then he'd be done for good. He shipped out in January 1974. The letters came regularly for the first month. Short, careful notes that said nothing and everything. He missed her. He was safe. It would be over soon. Then the letter stopped. In March 1974, two officers came to her door. She knew before they spoke what they were going to say. Missing in action, presumed dead, a helicopter crash in the mountains of Vietnam. No bodies recovered. She'd buried an empty casket, accepted the folded flag, tried to move on. Then 3 months later, the letter arrived, postmarked from Montana. Written in Silas's unmistakable cramped handwriting, talking about a railroad spur, about something buried, about proof. She'd gone to the Navy. They'd told her it was impossible. Silas was dead. Perhaps someone was playing a cruel joke. She'd gone to Montana herself, to the tiny post office in the town listed on the postmark, to the land office, to the sheriff. No one had seen Silas. No one knew anything. For years she'd searched, hired private investigators, pestered government officials, slowly went broke chasing a ghost. Eventually she remarried, had a son, built a different life, but she never forgot, and she never stopped wondering. Her second husband died in 1995. Her son died in 2019, leaving her with a nephew she barely knew named Travis. And with the last of her savings, she'd bought back the Montana land that Silas's letter had mentioned. The land that was supposed to hold answers. Travis had seemed so helpful, so concerned, so ready to finally give her the closure she'd sought for 50 years. Instead, he'd taken everything. And Boone, Grant asked? Silas always wanted a German shepherd. Said they were the best working dogs, the most loyal. Eleanor's hand rested on the sleeping dog's head. I got Boone as a puppy 7 years ago. Trained him myself. He was all I had left of that dream. Grant watched the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow was beginning to fall, visible in the faint light from the cabin's window. You should rest, he said. What about you? I'll keep watch. It was the truth. Grant knew he wouldn't sleep. Not with an injured animal in his care. Not with the weight of Eleanor's story settling over him like snow. He sat in the wooden chair and stared into the flames, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. A 50-year-old mystery, a nephew who'd stolen from his own family. A dog that had been attacked and left for dead but had somehow survived to find its owner. And himself, a man who'd come here to hide from his failures, now caught in someone else's desperate search for truth. He should tell Eleanor to leave in the morning, should make it clear he wanted no part of whatever conspiracy or tragedy had consumed her husband half a century ago. He should. But when he looked at Boone, at the rise and fall of the dog's chest, at the peaceful expression on the animal's face despite its pain, he felt something shift inside him. Recognition, maybe. Soldier to soldier. This dog had completed a mission. Against impossible odds, wounded and alone, it had found its objective and refused to quit. That kind of loyalty deserved respect. Grant added another log to the fire and settled in for the long watch. Outside, the snow fell heavier. Inside, 3 survivors of different wars found temporary shelter from the storm. And somewhere in the darkness of the Montana wilderness, secrets 50 years buried waited to be unearthed. Boone woke at first light. Grant saw the moment it happened, the shift from unconsciousness to awareness, the flicker of recognition in those dark eyes. The dog didn't move, didn't try to stand, just watched, assessed, calculated. Smart animal. Eleanor stirred in her makeshift bed by the fire, her movements stiff with age and a night spent on the floor. She saw Boone awake, and her face transformed with relief. "Hey, boy," she whispered. "You came back to me." Boone's tail moved once, a single deliberate wag that said everything. Grant checked the wound. No fresh bleeding, no signs of infection yet, though it was still early. The stitches held. The dog's temperature felt normal under his palm, and when he offered water, Boone drank. Small sips, careful, like he knew his own limitations. "He needs rest," Grant said. "At least a week, maybe 2. I can't take him back to my apartment. Travis knows where I live. If he did this..." Eleanor's voice trailed off. Grant had already worked through this problem during the long night. The logical solution was clear. The safe solution. Tell Eleanor to take Boone to a proper vet, to go to the police, to let the authorities handle whatever mess her nephew had created. But Grant had learned long ago that the logical solution and the right solution weren't always the same thing. "He stays here," Grant heard himself say, "with me until he heals. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm telling you, this is what's happening." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Grant saw the question in her eyes. Why would a stranger do this? What was he getting out of it? He had no answer for her. Didn't have one for himself either. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally. Grant drove her back to Whitefish an hour later. leaving Boone curled by the fire with a bowl of water and strict instructions not to move. The dog had watched him leave with an expression that was almost amused, like he knew Grant would be back. The drive down the mountain was treacherous. 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight and more was coming. The truck's wipers fought a losing battle against the flakes that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You should get out before the roads close," Grant said as they reached the edge of town. "I will. I just need to pick up a few things from home." "Where's home?" Eleanor directed him to a small apartment complex on the Peel side of Whitefish. 2 stories, maybe 20 units, the kind of place where people went when downsizing became a necessity rather than a choice. "Thank you again," Eleanor said as she reached for the door handle. "For everything." Grant nodded, watched her shuffle toward the entrance, her movements slow and careful on the icy walkway. He was about to drive away when he saw it. A gray Audi SUV parked 3 spaces down, Montana plates. And sitting behind the wheel watching Eleanor's apartment with the focused intensity of a predator was a man in his late 20s. Well-dressed, clean-cut, the kind of guy who looked like he sold insurance or investment portfolios or some other respectable lie. Travis Kane. Grant's instincts, honed by years of hunting and being hunted, went on high alert. He cut the engine and settled back in his seat watching. Travis didn't move as Eleanor entered the building. Just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at her front door. Waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then Eleanor emerged carrying a small overnight bag. She moved toward the street, probably looking for a taxi. Travis's door opened. Grant was out of his truck before conscious thought. He crossed the parking lot with long, easy strides, positioning himself between Travis and Eleanor. "Mrs. Hartwell," he called out. Eleanor turned surprised. Travis froze 1 foot out of his vehicle. Grant reached Eleanor and took her bag. "Forgot you were still waiting. Come on, I'll give you a ride to the bus station." He kept his body angled toward Travis, his peripheral vision tracking every movement. The younger man was good-sized, maybe 6 feet athletic build, but he had the soft edges of someone who worked out in a gym, not someone who'd been forged in places where weakness meant death. Their eyes met. Grant let Travis see exactly what he was. A man who'd done violence and would do it again without hesitation if circumstances required. Travis's jaw tightened. He got back into his Audi without a word and drove away. Eleanor's hand shook on Grant's arm. "That was him. That was Travis." "I know. He was watching my apartment." "I know that too." Grant loaded her into the truck and drove to the bus station, checking his mirrors constantly. The Audi didn't reappear, but that didn't mean much. Travis knew where Eleanor lived, knew what she drove, knew her patterns and habits. "You can't go back there," Grant said as they pulled up to the small station. "I don't have anywhere else." "You have family, friends." "Not anymore. Everyone's dead or moved away or just tired of my obsession with Silas." Grant drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. This wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. He'd done his good deed for the year. Saved the dog, given the old woman a safe night. That should be enough. Should be. "The cabin has room," he said. "Not much, but it's safe, and your dog's already there." Eleanor turned to look at him. "I can't impose on you like that." "Lady, you already have. Might as well make it official." She smiled, then a real smile that took years off her face. "Silas would have liked you." "Don't count on it. I'm not likable." But he drove her back up the mountain anyway. The next 7 days fell into a rhythm. Grant chopped wood and maintained the cabin and kept watch over his 2 unexpected guests. Eleanor cooked, or tried to, though her shaking hands made it difficult. She told stories about Silas, about their brief marriage, about the life they'd planned and never got to live. And Boone healed. The dog was a model patient. He ate when offered food, drank when offered water, and otherwise lay by the fire with the patience of a creature who understood that recovery took time. But his eyes were always moving, always watching, always waiting. On the 4th day, Grant noticed something odd. Boone had positioned himself by the cabin's north-facing window. Not sleeping, not resting, just sitting, staring out at the forest beyond with an intensity that made Grant's tactical instincts prickle. "What do you see, boy?" Grant asked. Boone didn't look at him, just kept staring, his body rigid, his ears forward. Grant looked too, saw nothing but trees and snow and the endless white expanse of wilderness. But Boone saw something else, something that pulled at him with a force Grant didn't understand. The behavior continued. Every day, Boone would spend hours at that window staring north. Sometimes he'd whine a low sound that vibrated with urgency. Sometimes he'd pace between the window and the door, his message clear. He needed to go out there. "What's he doing?" Eleanor asked on the 5th day. I don't know, but he's trying to tell us something. You think he knows where Silas is? Where the railroad spur is? Grant had been thinking exactly that, but it seemed impossible. Boone was 7 years old. Silas had disappeared 50 years ago. There was no logical connection. Except, did Silas ever take you to Montana before he disappeared? Eleanor frowned, thinking back across decades. Once, in 1972, right after we got married. We drove out here, camped for a week. He said he wanted to show me where we'd build our house someday. Where did you camp? I don't remember exactly. Somewhere north of here. There was an old railroad spur, I think. He said it had been abandoned since the 50s. Grant felt something cold settle in his chest. You brought Boone to Montana. Yes, 7 years ago, I wanted to scatter some of my son's ashes in the place Silas loved. Boone was just a puppy then. I let him run around while I hiked. 7 years ago, a puppy. Impressionable. Forming memories that would last a lifetime. Could you find that place again? I don't know, maybe. It's been so long. Grant looked at Boone, who had abandoned his post at the window to sit directly in front of the door. The dog turned to look at him, and Grant saw it clearly. Determination, purpose, mission focus. This dog knew where he needed to go, and he wasn't going to stop until he got there. We need supplies, Grant said. Real winter gear, GPS, emergency beacon, enough food for 3 days. You're going out there. Eleanor's voice carried equal parts hope and fear. No, Grant said. We're going out there. All three of us. He spent the 6th and 7th days preparing. He drove to Whitefish and bought proper mountaineering equipment, crampons, ice axes, a satellite communicator, high-calorie emergency rations, a medical kit that could handle anything short of a bullet wound. At the hardware store, he ran into May from the diner. She looked at his purchases and shook her head. You're going into the backcountry in February. That's right. That's stupid. Probably. She helped him anyway, pointing out which brands held up in extreme cold, which emergency blankets actually worked, which fire starters wouldn't fail when you needed them most. Whatever you're looking for out there, she said, be careful. People have died in those mountains. I know. No, I mean recently. Last year, a hiker went missing near Dead Valley. They found his body 3 months later. Hypothermia. But there were other injuries too, like someone didn't want him out there. Grant's hands stilled on the pack he was examining. The police investigate. Sheriff said it was a fall. Case closed. May's expression said she didn't believe that for a second. Grant paid cash and loaded the gear into his truck. On the drive back to the cabin, he made a decision. Whatever they found out there, whatever Silas had died trying to prove, Grant would see it through. Not because he believed in conspiracy theories or 50-year-old mysteries, but because Boone believed, and Eleanor believed, and sometimes faith was enough. The 8th day dawned clear and brutally cold. -10 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind that could strip the skin off exposed flesh in minutes. Perfect weather for making catastrophically bad decisions. Grant loaded the pack while Eleanor bundled herself in every warm layer she owned. Boone stood by the door, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes bright with anticipation. This is insane, Grant said to no one in particular. Eleanor smiled. Silas used to say that about most of his best ideas. They set out at 8 in the morning, giving themselves maximum daylight. Grant had plotted a route based on Eleanor's vague memories in the topographical maps he'd studied. North and east, following the old railroad survey lines that were barely visible on modern maps. Boone took point immediately. He moved with the confidence of a two who knew exactly where he was going, his nose occasionally dropping to the snow to confirm a scent only he could detect. He remembers, Eleanor said, wonder in her voice. After 7 years, he remembers. They hiked for 3 hours. The terrain was brutal, steep grades and hidden ice and snow that could be 3 inches deep or 3 feet with no warning. Grant kept Eleanor on a short tether, literally a rope tied around her waist and clipped to his belt. If she fell, he'd catch her. Boone ranged ahead, always visible, always checking back to make sure they followed. Around noon, he stopped at the edge of a frozen stream and wouldn't cross. Grant approached carefully. The ice looked solid, but he'd learned to trust the dog's instincts. He tested it with a stick. Solid. He tested it with his weight slowly. Still solid. But Boone refused to cross here. Instead, he led them 50 yards upstream to a place where the ice was clearly thicker, reinforced by rocks underneath. Smart dog, Grant muttered. They crossed safely and continued. The landscape grew wilder, more remote. Trees that hadn't seen an axe in a century. Snow untouched by any track except wildlife. And something else. a feeling Grant recognized from combat zones. They were being watched. He didn't say anything to Eleanor, just kept his hand near the rifle slung across his chest and his eyes scanning the tree line. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was instinct. Either way, he listened. At 2 in the afternoon, Boone's behavior changed. He'd been moving with steady purpose all day, but now he stopped completely. His body went rigid. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Grant's hand went to his rifle. "What is it?" Boone stared ahead toward a thick stand of ancient pines. Grant looked but saw nothing. Then the wind shifted and he smelled it. Smoke. Not wildfire smoke. This was wood smoke. Man-made, controlled. Someone was out here. Grant signaled Eleanor to stay put. He moved forward using the trees for cover, every sense on high alert. Boone moved with him, silent now all business. They crested a small rise and Grant saw it. A cabin. No, not a cabin. A railroad car. An old freight train, ancient and weathered, sitting impossibly in the middle of the wilderness, miles from the nearest track. And from its chimney, a thin curl of smoke rose into the cold air. Grant's mind raced through possibilities. Squatters, hunters, survivalists. All plausible. All wrong. Because the door to the railroad car wasn't just closed. It was locked from the outside. Heavy chain, massive padlock. New hardware on ancient wood. Someone was being kept in there. Or something was being kept in. And whoever had locked it hadn't bothered to put out the fire first. Grant moved closer, Boone at his heels. The windows of the rail car had been boarded over from the outside, but there were gaps. He peered through one. Inside, barely visible, in the dim light from a dying fire, he saw movement. A person, lying on a cot, barely moving. "Eleanor," he called back quietly. "Come here." Slowly. She appeared beside him, breathing hard from the hike. He showed her the rail car, the lock, the smoke. "Someone's in there," he said. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. "Oh my God." Grant pulled out his satellite phone and tried to call 911. No signal. Too deep in the valley, too many mountains between them and civilization. They were on their own. He examined the lock. Industrial grade. Not something he could pick. Not something he could shoot off without risking whoever was inside. "Stand back," he said. He pulled out the small crowbar from his pack, wedged it behind the door hinge screws, and applied pressure. The wood was old, rotted by decades of weather. The screws gave with a shriek of rusted metal. The door fell inward. Grant stepped inside, rifle ready, Boone beside him. The interior of the rail car was dimly lit by a fire that had burned down to coals, a table with papers scattered across it, a camping stove, canned food stacked on a shelf, and on a cot in the corner, wrapped in blankets that looked older than Grant, a woman. 80 years old if she was a day. White hair matted with sweat, face gaunt with starvation, and on her left wrist a handcuff chained to the railcar's metal frame. Eleanor pushed past him with a cry that was half sob, half rage. The woman's eyes opened, focused, and widened with recognition. "Eleanor." The voice was barely a whisper. "Oh my God, Catherine Morrison." Grant didn't know who Catherine Morrison was, but Eleanor clearly did. She dropped to her knees beside the cot, her hands touching the woman's face like she was confirming a miracle. "I thought you were dead," Eleanor sobbed. "They said you moved away, that you left town." "Travis," Catherine whispered. "Your nephew, he did this." Grant was already working on the handcuff. It was cheap hardware store quality, easy to pick with the tools in his kit. It opened in less than a minute. Catherine's wrist was raw underneath the skin, torn and infected from months of struggling against the metal. Grant's jaw tightened. "How long?" he asked. 3 months, maybe longer. I lost track. He did a quick assessment: severe dehydration, malnutrition, early stages of hypothermia, but alive. Stubbornly, impossibly alive. "Ma'am, I need to get you warm, get fluids into you, then we're getting you out of here." He wrapped her in his emergency blanket, the kind that reflected body heat, started a small amount of water heating on the camping stove. She needed to be rehydrated slowly, carefully. Too much too fast would kill her. While the water warmed, Grant examined the rail car. The table was covered in papers, old documents, maps, photographs, and a journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. He picked it up. The first entry was dated November 7th, 3 months ago. "Travis brought me here today, said it was to help me find answers about Silas. I was so grateful, so trusting. What a fool." Grant flipped forward. The entries told a story of escalating horror. Travis keeping Catherine here, demanding information about land deeds, about mineral rights, about something worth millions. The final entry was dated 2 days ago. He hasn't brought food in a week. I think he's decided to let me die. Eleanor, if you ever find this, know that I tried to protect what Silas left behind. The documents are buried under the railcar's southwest corner. 3 feet down. Tell the truth. Make them pay. Grant looked at Eleanor. Who is she? Catherine Morrison. She was Silas's partner. They were both in Navy intelligence. When Silas disappeared, she tried to find him. Spent 20 years looking. Then she just vanished. I thought Travis helped her move to Arizona. Your nephew lied. About everything. Eleanor's voice was ice. Grant gave Catherine small sips of warm water. She drank gratefully, her eyes clearing slightly with each swallow. How did you find me? She asked. Boone, Eleanor said simply. As if hearing his name, the dog approached. He laid his head gently on the cot next to Catherine's hand. She touched him with shaking fingers. Good boy, she whispered. Such a good boy. Grant stepped outside to try the satellite phone again. Still nothing. The valley was too deep, the mountains too high. He was about to go back inside when he heard it. An engine, distant but getting closer. Snowmobile. Grant's hand went to his rifle. He moved to a position with good sight lines and waited. The sound grew louder. Then emerging from the trees, a single snowmobile appeared. The rider wore expensive winter gear and moved with the confidence of someone who owned this land. Travis Kane, he saw Grant's tracks, saw the broken door, saw Grant standing there with a rifle. To his credit, he didn't run. Just stopped the snowmobile 20 yards out and pulled off his helmet. You're trespassing, Travis called out. You're imprisoning an elderly woman, Grant called back. I don't know what you're talking about. The woman handcuffed inside the rail car behind me suggests otherwise. Travis's expression didn't change. That woman is mentally ill. I was keeping her safe. Safe and starving are different things. You don't understand the situation here. Then explain it. Travis climbed off the snowmobile, kept his hands visible, started walking closer. Grant tracked him with the rifle finger outside the trigger guard, but ready. That land my aunt sold you, Travis said. There's lithium under it, $40 million worth. But there's a problem. Back in the 70s, the Navy dumped uranium waste out here. If that gets out, the whole mining operation shuts down. Catherine has proof. Documents, photos, enough to destroy everything. So you locked her up. I offered her money, a lot of money. She refused. Said the truth mattered more than profit. Travis's laugh was bitter. The truth, like the truth, pays medical bills. Like the truth keeps towns alive. You tortured her dog. The mutt wouldn't stop barking. I had to shut it up. Grant felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. The same feeling he got before pulling a trigger. You're going to prison, he said. No, Travis said. I'm not. He pulled a pistol from his jacket. Not fast, not smooth, but committed. Grant could have shot him, should have shot him. His training screamed at him to neutralize the threat. But he hesitated. 1 second, maybe 2. That's when Boone exploded from the rail car. 80 pounds of furious German shepherd hit Travis at a full run. The pistol went flying. Travis went down, screaming, Boone's jaws clamped on his forearm. Boone off, Grant commanded. The dog released immediately and backed away, still growling. Travis scrambled backward, clutching his bleeding arm. Grant kicked the pistol away and stood over him. Don't move, Grant said. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She looked at Travis at the blood, at the fear in his eyes. And Grant saw something in her expression that was colder than the Montana winter. You said you'd help me, she said to Travis. You said you cared. And Eleanor, I can explain. You tortured my dog. You imprisoned my friend. You lied about Silas. Her voice never rose, never wavered. I have nothing more to say to you. She turned and went back inside. Grant zip-tied Travis's hands behind his back with the restraints he carried in his pack. Then he tried the satellite phone one more time. This time, miraculously, he got a signal. 911, what's your emergency? This is Grant Thorne. I'm in the Dead Valley area, approximately 48.7 degrees north, 114.2 west. I have a kidnapping victim requiring immediate medical attention and a suspect in custody. We need a helicopter extraction. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm. Sir, can you confirm the kidnapping victim's condition? Grant looked back at the rail car, at Catherine, who Eleanor was caring for with infinite gentleness, at Boone, who had taken up guard position by the door. She's alive, Grant said. That's going to have to be enough. The helicopter came 90 minutes later, its rotors beating the air into submission as it descended into the small clearing Grant had marked with emergency flares. Two paramedics jumped out before the skids fully touched snow, their movements practiced and efficient. Grant watched them work on Catherine. Blood pressure cuff, IV line, oxygen mask. The lead medic, a woman in her 40s with steady hands, looked up at him. How long was she like this? She says 3 months, maybe longer. The medic's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, just continued her assessment with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty and learned to channel rage into action. They loaded Catherine onto a stretcher. Eleanor climbed in beside her without asking permission, and the medics didn't object. Before the door closed, Eleanor looked back at Grant. "Thank you," she said. Words that carried the weight of 50 years. Grant nodded, watched the helicopter lift off its navigation lights, disappearing into the gray sky. Then he turned to where Travis sat zip-tied to a tree, blood from Boone's bite soaking through his expensive jacket. "Sheriff's on his way," Grant said. "Should be here in about 2 hours. Until then, you and I are going to have a conversation." Travis's eyes held fear and calculation in equal measure. "I want a lawyer. You'll get one. After you tell me what really happened to Silas Hartwell." "I don't know anything about that. That was 50 years ago." Grant pulled out the journal he'd found in the rail car. Catherine's journal, flipped to a page near the middle and read aloud. "March 15th, Travis came today. He knows about the uranium dump. He knows about the Navy cover-up. He knows everything because I was stupid enough to trust him with Silas's research. Now he wants me to sign papers that will bury the truth forever." Grant looked up. "Want to revise your statement?" Travis said nothing. Grant continued reading. "April 2nd, he brought the handcuff today. Said if I won't cooperate willingly, he'll keep me here until I do. He took my phone, my medications, everything. Said no one's looking for me anyway. Said Eleanor thinks I moved to Arizona. He's right. No one's looking." The words hung in the cold air. Grant closed the journal. "Silas Hartwell died trying to expose what you wanted buried. Catherine Morrison spent 20 years trying to finish his work, and you tried to erase them both." "You don't understand," Travis said. His voice carried the whine of someone who'd convinced himself his cruelty was justified. "That lithium deposit could save this whole region. Jobs, money, a future. But not if the Navy dumping site gets discovered. Not if there are environmental investigations. Everything dies. So you decided Catherine should die instead." "I didn't decide anything. I just gave her a choice. Sign the papers or stay out here until she saw reason. You starved her. I brought food. Once a week, barely enough to keep her alive." Travis looked away. "She was old, confused. It would have been ruled natural causes." Grant felt the familiar cold rage settling over him. The same feeling he'd had in Mosul when he'd found civilians locked in a basement left to die by insurgents who decided they were acceptable losses. He'd killed those men, efficiently, without hesitation, without remorse. Looking at Travis now, he felt the same impulse. Instead, he walked away. Sat down next to Boone, who had positioned himself where he could watch both Travis and the trail. The dog leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "Good work today," Grant said quietly. Boone's tail thumped once against the snow. They waited. The sky darkened from gray to charcoal. The temperature dropped. Travis started shivering, and Grant did nothing to help him. Let him feel what Catherine had felt. Let the cold be a teacher. When Sheriff Rollins finally arrived on a snowmobile followed by 2 deputies, Grant gave his statement standing in the snow. Concise, factual, no embellishment needed. The sheriff was a man in his late 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life in these mountains. He listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from Grant to Travis to the railcar and back. "We'll need to process the scene," he said when Grant finished. "Document everything. You'll need to come to the station tomorrow for a formal statement." "I'll be there." "And the dog?" The sheriff looked at Boone with respect. "He attacked the suspect. He defended himself and others from an armed threat." Rollins nodded. "Justified use of force for a dog." There was the ghost of a smile. "Never thought I'd write that in a report." They loaded Travis onto a snowmobile, hands still zip-tied. As they prepared to leave, Travis looked back at Grant. "You're going to regret this," he said. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." Grant met his eyes. "I've stepped into worse, and I'm still here." The sheriff's convoy disappeared into the darkening forest. Grant stood alone in the clearing with Boone surrounded by silence and snow and the weight of what they'd found. He should have felt relief. Mission accomplished. Woman saved. Bad guy caught. Instead, he felt the familiar hollowness that always came after the action ended. The knowledge that saving one person didn't erase the ones you'd failed to save. Boone nudged his hand. Grant looked down. The dog was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and Grant would have sworn the animal understood exactly what he was thinking. "Come on," Grant said. "Let's go home." The hike back to the cabin took 4 hours. Full darkness had fallen, and Grant navigated by headlamp and GPS, trusting Boone to alert him to any dangers the technology missed. The dog never failed, pausing at icy patches, steering them around hidden obstacles, leading them safely through terrain that could kill the careless. They reached the cabin near midnight. Grant built up the fire-fed Boone and collapsed into the wooden chair. He was asleep in minutes. He woke to find Boone staring at him. Not the usual patient dog waiting for breakfast, something more urgent. The dog was at the window again, the north-facing window, staring into the forest with the same intensity he'd shown for days before the journey. "What now?" Grant asked. Boone looked at him, then back at the window, back at Grant. The message was clear. It wasn't over. Grant made coffee and thought it through. They'd found Catherine, arrested Travis, but the original mystery remained. What had Silas Hartwell discovered? What had he died trying to expose? Catherine's journal mentioned documents buried under the rail car. But in the chaos of the rescue, Grant hadn't looked, hadn't had time. He pulled out the topographical map and marked the rail car's location, then pulled out his phone and searched for information on railroad history in the area. The Dead Valley Railroad spur, built in 1952, abandoned in 1955, designed to service a mining operation that never materialized. Or so the official records claimed. But there were other records, declassified Navy documents from the 70s, mentions of a remote disposal site, a place where radioactive waste from decommissioned submarines could be buried far from population centers. Dead Valley. Grant searched further, found news articles from 1974. A Navy SEAL named Silas Hartwell declared missing in action in Vietnam. Memorial service held. Widow declined to comment. But there was another article, smaller, from a Montana newspaper. Local environmentalist raises concerns about water quality near abandoned railroad spur. Navy denies any operations in area. Investigation closed due to lack of evidence. The environmentalist's name was Robert Chen. Grant searched that name. Found an obituary from 1975. Robert Chen, age 32, died in a hiking accident in Dead Valley. Survived by wife and young son. No foul play suspected. Then he searched for the sheriff who'd handled that case. Retired now, living in Florida. But there were letters to the editor from the late 70s, people questioning the investigation, asking why Chen's hiking gear had been found miles from his body, why there were injuries inconsistent with a fall. The letters stopped in 1980. No explanation, just silence. Grant sat back. The pattern was clear. Silas Hartwell had found evidence of illegal dumping. Robert Chen had tried to expose it. Both had died. Both deaths ruled accidents or combat casualties. Both forgotten. Until Eleanor refused to forget. Until Catherine refused to let it go. Until a dog remembered a place he'd been once as a puppy and knew with animal certainty that it mattered. Grant looked at Boone. "You know we have to go back, don't you?" The dog's tail wagged. "Of course you do." This time Grant went prepared. Excavation tools, metal detector, ground-penetrating radar unit borrowed from a geology professor in Missoula who asked no questions. He returned to the railcar 3 days after the rescue, accompanied by Sheriff Rollins and a federal environmental inspector. They found the burial site exactly where Catherine's journal said it would be. 3 feet under the railcar's southwest corner, wrapped in waterproof plastic that had deteriorated over 50 years. Inside photographs, documents. Water quality reports showing radiation levels 200 times normal. Maps marking the locations of 127 barrels of uranium waste. And a letter written in Silas Hartwell's careful hand, dated March 1974. Grant read it aloud while the inspector photographed everything. "To whoever finds this, my name is Lieutenant Silas James Hartwell, United States Navy. In January 1974, I was assigned to a classified disposal operation in Montana. We were told the material was inert. We were told the location had been approved by environmental agencies. We were told we were serving our country. All lies. The barrels contain high-level radioactive waste. The site was chosen because it's remote, not because it's safe. The waste is leaching into the groundwater. I have water samples proving contamination. I have documents showing the Navy knew and approved this operation anyway." I confronted my commanding officer. He told me to forget what I'd seen or face court-martial for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. I couldn't forget. I couldn't let this poison the land and the people. So I took the evidence and ran. They'll call me a deserter, a traitor. But the real betrayal is what they did to this place. If you're reading this, please finish what I started. Tell the truth. Make them clean it up. Eleanor, if it's you reading this, know that I loved you, that I'm sorry, that I would have come back if I could, but they're hunting me and I won't lead them to you. Stay safe, stay strong, and know that some things are worth dying for. Silas Hartwell, March 15th, 1974. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the pines. The inspector, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, looked up from her camera. Her face was pale. "This is real," she said. "The contamination is real. We'll need to do a full survey, but based on these coordinates and the timeline, we're looking at one of the largest illegal dumping sites in U.S. history." Sheriff Rollins removed his hat. "How many people?" "Potentially exposed, the groundwater feeds into 3 river systems, tens of thousands downstream. Maybe more." Jesus. Grant looked at the rail car, at the place where Catherine had been imprisoned for trying to tell this truth, at the ground where Silas Hartwell's evidence had waited half a century for someone to believe. "What happens now?" he asked. Dr. Mitchell was already on her phone. "EPA gets called, Navy gets called. This becomes a federal case. The cleanup will take years, cost hundreds of millions, but it should have been done 50 years ago. And the people responsible, most are probably dead, but the institutional responsibility remains. There will be investigations, lawsuits, congressional hearings." She looked at Grant. "You just opened Pandora's box." "Good," Grant said. But as he stood there in the Montana wilderness looking at the evidence of 50 years of lies, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about blame or punishment. This was about the truth. The kind of truth Silas had died for. The kind Catherine had survived imprisonment to protect. The kind Eleanor had spent 50 years seeking. And now, because of a G who'd refused to forget, that truth would finally be told. Grant stepped outside to give Catherine and Eleanor privacy. He pulled out the land deed again, studying it in the fading light. Eleanor Hayes and Silas James Hartwell. The names stared back at him. Silas James Hartwell. James, his middle name, his father's middle name, a family name passed down through generations, or so his mother had always said, but she'd never told him where it came from. Never mentioned a grandfather who'd served in the Navy, never explained why that particular name mattered. Grant pulled out his phone. Barely any signal, but enough for a search. Silas Hartwell, Navy, 1974. The results loaded slowly. A memorial page, a list of SEALs declared MIA in Vietnam, and there 3 entries down: Lieutenant Silas James Hartwell, presumed killed in action, survived by wife Eleanor Hayes. Grant's hands went cold. He clicked another link. An obituary from 1980. Eleanor Hayes remarried to George Morrison. One son, James Morrison, born 1976. James Morrison, his father's name, his father who'd died when Grant was 12. His father who'd never known his real father. His father who'd been told his dad died before he was born. Grant looked through the cabin door at Eleanor, at the woman who'd hired him, who'd trusted him with her dog, who'd led him into the wilderness on faith alone. Eleanor Hayes, Eleanor Morrison, Eleanor Hartwell. His grandmother, the woman he'd spent a week living with, protecting, helping. The woman whose story had seemed so distant, so separate from his own life, was family. Grant's chest tightened. He thought about all the times his mother had mentioned her mother-in-law, the mysterious Eleanor who'd disappeared after his father was born, who'd never been part of their lives, who'd been written off as unstable, unreliable, lost to grief. She'd been here, all along, searching for a truth no one believed, searching for a husband who'd died protecting that truth. And Grant had bought the land where it all began, had been pulled into this story not by coincidence, but by something deeper, something that felt like destiny or destinée, or the ghost of a grandfather he'd never known reaching across 50 years to finish what he'd started. "You okay out there?" Eleanor called from inside. Grant wiped his eyes. When had he started crying? "Yeah," he called back. His voice sounded strange, hollow. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He was standing in the snow holding proof that his entire understanding of his family history was wrong. That the grandfather who'd supposedly died a hero in Vietnam had actually died a fugitive in Montana. That the grandmother he'd never met was the woman who'd just saved him from a life of pointless isolation. That everything he'd thought he was running from had actually been pulling him home. The story broke 3 days later. National news. Historic Navy cover-up exposed by veteran and rescued prisoner. The photographs of the documents went viral. The image of Catherine Morrison, 80 years old and weighing 90 pounds, being carried from a rail car in the Montana wilderness became a symbol. Grant's phone rang constantly. Reporters, documentary filmmakers, book agents. He ignored them all. What he couldn't ignore was the letter that arrived at the cabin 1 week after the discovery, hand-delivered by Sheriff Rollins, who looked grim. "This came to my office," the sheriff said. "From the Navy. They want to talk to you." The letter was formal, official. A request for Grant to meet with Navy investigators regarding the Hartwell case and his discovery of classified materials. "Do I have to go?" Grant asked. "Technically, no, but they're not going away. And there are still questions about what happened to Silas Hartwell. If he really died in 1974, or if he survived longer." Grant thought about the letter Silas had written. The date, March 1974. But Catherine's journal mentioned something else, something he'd noted but not fully processed. He pulled out the journal and found the entry. "May 1997, I found a man living in the mountains near Dead Valley. He wouldn't tell me his name, but he knew things about Silas only Silas would know. He was dying. Lung cancer, he said. Radiation exposure. He gave me coordinates to the rail car, made me promise to finish what he started. Then he walked away into the forest. I never saw him again." Grant showed the entry to Rollins. "Catherine thinks Silas survived until 1997. She's certain, said she'd recognize him anywhere even after 23 years. But by then he was too sick, too damaged. He chose to die alone rather than bring this fight to Eleanor's doorstep." Rollins was quiet for a long moment. "That's one hell of a love story." "Yeah," Grant said, "it is." He met with the Navy investigators in Missoula. Two officers, both younger than him, both carrying themselves with the rigid formality of people delivering uncomfortable truths. They confirmed that Silas Hartwell had been part of the disposal operation, confirmed that he'd gone AWOL in March 1974, but they had no record of his death, no body, no closure. "Did you kill him?" Grant asked bluntly. The senior officer, a commander named Peterson, met his eyes. "I wasn't born when this happened. Neither was my colleague. We're trying to find the truth just like you. The truth is in those documents. The truth is that your institution poisoned American land and tried to silence anyone who objected. I know, and we're going to make it right. The cleanup has been authorized. Full environmental remediation. Medical monitoring for everyone potentially exposed. It'll take a decade and cost $1 billion, but it's happening. Because you got caught." "Yes," Peterson said simply, "because we got caught." Grant appreciated the honesty at least. "What about Silas Hartwell? Will he get his name back?" "We're reviewing his service record. The desertion charge will be expunged. He'll be listed as having died in the line of duty. His widow will receive full benefits, back pay, and a formal apology." "Eleanor's the widow, but there was someone else, Catherine Morrison. She spent 20 years trying to prove Silas was right. We know she'll be compensated as well. Both women will receive recognition for their service to environmental justice." It was something, not enough, could never be enough, but something. Grant stood to leave. Peterson stopped him. "One more thing, the dog, Boone. The Navy would like to honor him as well. Official commendation for service to the nation." Grant almost laughed. "You want to give a medal to a dog? That dog uncovered one of the biggest environmental crimes in modern history. Yeah, we want to give him a medal." Grant thought about Boone, about the mission focus, the loyalty, the refusal to quit even when wounded and alone. "He'd probably rather have a steak," Grant said. "We can arrange both." Catherine Morrison spent 2 weeks in the hospital and emerged with a steel-backed walker and a determination that made the nurses nervous. Eleanor visited daily, the two women spending hours talking about Silas, about the years they'd lost, about the fight they'd won. Travis Kane was charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and a dozen other felonies. His lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed Travis had been trying to protect the local economy, suggested his actions were misguided but well-intentioned. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge gave him 35 years. Not because the law required it, because Travis had shown no remorse, had testified under oath that he'd do it again if given the chance because some truths were too expensive to tell. The judge disagreed. "The truth," she said, "is the only thing we can't afford to lose." Travis was led away in chains. Grant, watching from the gallery, felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just the cold knowledge that justice, when it finally arrived, couldn't undo the harm that had come before. Spring came to Montana slowly, grudgingly, the snow retreating inch by inch to reveal the mud and promise underneath. Grant's cabin, which had been a place of isolation, became something else. Eleanor moved in, taking over the small loft space Grant built for her. She cooked meals that actually tasted like food, organized his chaos, filled the silence with stories and laughter, and the presence of someone who'd learned that family wasn't always blood. Catherine visited weekly, driven up the mountain by volunteers from town who'd adopted her as a cause. She'd bring newspapers, magazines, updates on the cleanup operation. The EPA had found contamination even worse than Silas's documents suggested. The remediation would take 15 years, but it was happening. Grant built a workshop behind the cabin, started taking on projects, furniture repair, metalwork, things that required his hands and his focus, but not his soul. He discovered he was good at it, that creating something was easier than destroying. And Boone remained Boone, steady, loyal, present in the way only dogs can be, asking nothing but offering everything. 2 weeks after the trial, Grant finally found the courage to tell Eleanor the truth. They were sitting on the porch watching Boone patrol the tree line with his usual diligence. The spring sun was warm, the first real warmth after months of brutal cold. "Eleanor," Grant said, "I need to tell you something." She turned to him, her eyes still sharp despite her age. "You've been holding something back for weeks. I can see it in how you look at me." Grant pulled out his phone, showed her the search results he'd found that day at the rail car, the family tree he'd pieced together, the documents proving what he'd suspected. "Silas was my grandfather," he said quietly. "My father was James Morrison, your son." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the phone, read the screen, read it again, then looked up at Grant with eyes that had gone very wide. "James had a son. He had me. I was 12 when he died. Car accident. My mother raised me alone after that. She never talked much about his family. Said his mother had left when he was a baby, that she'd never been stable, never been there." Eleanor's face crumpled. "I didn't leave him. I thought giving him to George Morrison's family was the kindest thing. I was broken. Searching for Silas. No money, no stability. I thought he deserved better than a mother who couldn't let go of a ghost." "He needed you," Grant said. "I needed you." "I know." Eleanor was crying now, silent tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "I know, and I can't get those years back. Can't undo the choice I made. But Grant," she reached for his hand, "you're here now. You found me, or I found you, or Silas brought us together. However it happened, you're here." Grant nodded, couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. "I bought this land," he said finally. "I spent every dollar I had on it. Thought I was buying isolation. Turns out I was buying my way home." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Silas always said there were no coincidences, only missions we don't understand yet." "What's the mission now?" "Live," Eleanor said simply. "Be family. Honor what Silas died for by actually living the life he wanted us to have." Grant looked out at the mountains, at the land that had cost so much blood and truth and sacrifice. "I can do that," he said. "Good," Eleanor said, "because I'm not losing you again. You're my grandson, my family, and Hartwell family doesn't quit." "No," Grant agreed, "we don't." Boone returned from his patrol and settled between them, his head resting on Grant's boot. 3 generations of Hartwells brought together by a dog who'd refused to forget. It wasn't the family Grant had expected, but it was the family he needed. On a warm day in April, they held a ceremony. Small, private, just Eleanor, Catherine Grant, Sheriff Rollins, and May from the diner. They gathered at the rail car, which had been preserved as part of the cleanup site, a reminder of what had been buried and what had been found. Eleanor unveiled a plaque in memory of Lieutenant Silas James Hartwell, United States Navy, who chose truth over silence, who gave his life to protect the land and the people, who loved greatly and sacrificed everything. May we honor his courage by never forgetting the cost of silence. Catherine added a second plaque. And in memory of Robert Chen and all those who tried to speak and were silenced, your voices echo still. They stood in silence. The wind through the pines sounded like applause. Life fell into rhythms. Grant built. Eleanor cooked. Boone supervised. One afternoon in late March, Grant was repairing the porch railing, replacing boards that had rotted over the winter. Boone lay in a patch of sunlight, watching with the critical eye of a foreman who'd seen better craftsmanship. Grant hammered a nail in crooked, had to pull it out and start over. "You gonna help?" he asked the dog, "or just judge my technique?" Boone's response was a slow blink, the kind that clearly communicated his opinion of Grant's carpentry skills. Then the dog stood, turned around, and presented his rear end to Grant before lying back down. Eleanor, watching from the doorway, laughed so hard she had to sit down. "That turbog," she gasped between laughs, is absolutely your grandfather's spirit animal. Grant looked at Boone's dismissive posture and couldn't help but grin. Yeah, he agreed, he really is. That evening, Grant sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Eleanor brought him coffee and sat in the chair beside him. You could leave now, she said. You found what I needed, saved who needed saving. Your work here is done. Grant sipped his coffee, watched Boone patrol the perimeter of the clearing, checking scents and sounds with professional thoroughness. I could, he agreed, but you won't. No? Why, ball, Grant thought about Martinez, about the weight he'd carried, about the mission he'd failed, about driving across the country looking for a place where that weight would finally lift. It hadn't lifted, probably never would. But here in this cabin with these people, with this ridiculous hero of a dog, it felt different. Not lighter, just distributed, shared among shoulders strong enough to help carry it. Because I found my mission, he said finally, which is stay. When leaving would be easier, stay. Eleanor smiled, reached over and squeezed his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Silas would have liked you, she said. Not the first time she'd said it, but this time Grant believed her. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. Outside, the forest breathed. And somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, part of the cleanup operation that would continue for years. The sound used to trigger Grant's PTSD. Used to send him spiraling back to Mosul, to Martinez, to all the things he couldn't fix. But now it was just a sound, a reminder that some things could be fixed. Some wrongs could be made right. Some silences could be broken. Not by one person, not by grand gestures or heroic sacrifice, but by people who chose to stay, who chose to listen, who chose to act when action was hard, by people in the docks who loved them. Boone returned from his patrol and settled at Grant's feet with a contented sigh. His fur was clean and thick, now the scar from the knife wound barely visible. He looked up at Grant with those dark eyes that had seen too much and forgiven everything. Good boy, Grant said. Boone's tail thumped against the wooden porch. One thump, one promise kept. And in the Montana wilderness, 3 survivors of different wars found something that had eluded them for years. Not peace. Peace was too simple a word for what they'd been through. But purpose. And in purpose, the beginning of healing. The story would be told for years. The veteran who uncovered a 50-year conspiracy. The widow who never stopped believing. The prisoner who survived 3 months of captivity. The dog who remembered. But sitting on that porch watching the stars emerge one by one over the mountains, Grant knew the real story was simpler. Sometimes miracles don't come as thunder and lightning. Sometimes they come as a dog at your door in a blizzard, as an old woman who refuses to forget, as a choice to follow when staying home would be safer, as the decision to dig when everyone says, let it lie. God doesn't always change the world in a day, doesn't always send angels or part seas or speak in voices of flame. Sometimes he just puts something faithful beside you and waits to see if you'll pay attention. Silas Hartwell had paid attention, had seen poison being buried and refused to look away, had died alone in these mountains rather than let that truth disappear. Catherine Morrison had paid attention, had spent 20 years searching when everyone said to move on, had survived imprisonment because she believed the truth mattered more than comfort. Eleanor had paid attention, had kept faith for 50 years, had trusted a dog when every logical person would have said it was just an animal. And Grant had finally paid attention, had followed when every instinct screamed to run, had stayed when leaving would have been easier. That was the miracle, not the discovery, not the rescue, not even the justice. The miracle was the choice to pay attention when the whole world said to look away. Inside the cabin, Eleanor began humming something, an old song from another era. Boone's ears perked up, recognizing the melody. Grant closed his eyes and listened. To the song, to the fire, to the night sounds of the forest, to the life that had somehow, against all odds, assembled itself here in this impossible place. He'd come to Montana to disappear. Instead, he'd been found, not by rescuers or therapists or well-meaning friends, but by a mission that had waited 50 years for someone stubborn enough to see it through. By 2 old women who turned out to be stronger than the institutions that had tried to break them, and by a dog who knew with the certainty that only animals possess that some things are worth fighting for. Even when you're wounded, even when you're alone, even when every rational voice says to quit, you keep going. You complete the mission. You bring everyone home. That's what Boone had done. That's what Grant would do. For as long as it took, for as long as he was needed, For as long as there was breath in his body and fire in his heart, and a dog at his side who refused to let him quit. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The mountains stood sentinel over secrets buried and secrets revealed. And in a small cabin that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and hope, 3 humans and 1 extraordinary dog settled in for the night. The covenant was kept. And tomorrow there would be new missions, new covenants, new chances to choose truth over silence, courage over comfort, staying over leaving. But that was tomorrow. Tonight they had this moment, this hard one, dearly bought, absolutely worth it peace. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope, someone who's searching, someone who's forgotten how to pay attention to the faithful things God puts in their path. Comment below, what moment stayed with you? Was it Boone's refusal to quit Eleanor's 50 years of faith? Grant finding family when he was looking for isolation? Subscribe to hear more stories like this. Stories of loyalty and redemption, of truth that refuses to stay buried, of ordinary people who make extraordinary choices. And may God bless you and keep you. May He guide your steps when the path is unclear. May He calm your fears when the darkness presses close. And may He place faithful companions beside you, 2-legged or 4 when you need them most. Because sometimes miracles don't come as thunder. They come as a knock at the door in a blizzard, as a dog who remembers, as a grandmother found, as a choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Pay attention to those moments. They might just save your life. Amen.